offshore wind, but a few of the other technologies that we're talking about, and give you some additional context of how we find ourselves basically on the doorstep of this offshore wind lease sale in the Gulf on August the 29th. Certainly with your offshore wind feasibility study, the port has been very smart, in my opinion, to lean in to this opportunity, and I really commend them for that work. Again, you heard Ricky talk about a $200 million possible port investment. That's significant. And again, I certainly agree with that assessment of the port being in an ideal location for these activities. And when you really think about it, it's our history with oil and gas exploration that plays to our advantage on something like offshore wind. You know, one, we've got a mature service sector and workers that know how to operate in a marine environment. Two, we've got a maritime sector that has actually delivered, produced vessels for the oil and gas sector, produced vessels for the military. And three, we like to say we have a working coast. We have ports along the coast that have served for hubs for these types of operations over the years, and it's not something that's new to Louisiana. It was really, I had the opportunity to go to Block Island. It was in the fall of 2019, so really almost 4 years ago. That kind of first U.S. offshore wind farm, 5 turbines, and really learned on that trip the Louisiana service companies that helped make that project a reality. It was companies like Arias Marine, Falcon Global, Gulf Island Fabrication, Keystone Engineering really contributed to Block Island's launch. So at the time, I came back to Baton Rouge and said, hey, we've got these companies that have been a part of kind of this maybe burgeoning industry, burgeoning sector. And then we also noticed the national laboratory studies that were coming out of the national lab up in Colorado talking about the economic potential. And you heard Ricky characterize that from a jobs potential as well as a cargo potential. So really over the last 3 years, we've put in the work on offshore wind, and I'm proud to be a part of that. Governor Edwards in October of 2020, a governor has to make a formal request of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And he did that then, sent a letter to BOEM to begin a formal process of evaluating the Gulf. BOEM, I think, based on some of its learnings, what was happening in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic, they came back to us and said, look, instead of having kind of a one-state task force, let's have a multi-state task force. So that's how our neighbors in Texas, Mississippi, and Alabama joined in on this intergovernmental task force. But I can tell you, over the course of the last 3 years, most of the interest has been shown by Louisiana entities. And we've been able to step through this very defined BOEM regulatory federal government process that put us on the cusp. Hopefully it will. It has put us on the cusp in 3 weeks of having this lease sale. Again, as Ricky indicated, those identified wind energy areas, 1 south of Lake Charles and 2 are east of Galveston. The area south of Lake Charles, it's over 100,000 developable acres, and what BOEM has said, it has potential to power about 435,000 homes. Again, I've kind of maintained for months now that this lease sale is really going to be the ultimate tell. What companies bid in 3 weeks and what type of financial value that they put on those bids. But certainly at LED, I know other economic development organizations across South Louisiana over the last couple of years, they've talked to a heck of a lot of the major offshore wind developers, and actually 15 kind of in this pre-bidding process indicated their interest to BOEM in the Gulf. So again, all indications point that the interest is there. You know, another key piece of this puzzle is that Louisiana's climate action plan has really been a differentiator. Companies have taken notice that this state has a plan like this. And if you recall, the governor in August of 2020, signed an executive order that created this thing that was called the Climate Initiatives Task Force that I had the privilege to serve on, and I really was given the task to look at strategies and actions to address the causes of climate change, but also take advantage of whatever economic opportunities that may come from this thing that was called the energy transition. 3 months later, in November of 2020, that task force began its work. It was a 15-month kind of multi-stakeholder process. Most of our meetings took place virtually over Zoom. We couldn't really meet in person, but we produced this plan on January 31st of 2020. And it remains the only such climate action plan for a state in the Gulf South. 28 high-level strategies, 84 different action items to try to meet that overarching goal of how can we get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And one of those specific action items was to develop 5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. But the energy addition is much more than just offshore wind in Louisiana. As the governor has said, he said this publicly, he said this in front of Congress numerous times. If decarbonization is the goal, it's going to take an all of the above approach to not only to continue to reduce emissions, but also to continue to provide the jobs and economic opportunities for our residents and for our businesses, like so many of you in this room. So on the hydrogen front, George and his team have been part of this effort known as H to the Future. It was led by G&O Inc. out of the New Orleans area, but it encompasses everything from the tip of the boot to the Louisiana-Texas border. And that effort won a $50 million grant from the U.S. Economic Development Administration last September, and it's been matched. It will be matched over the next 3 years with $24.5 million more from the state. So almost a $75 million effort, with the premise being, how can we build a clean hydrogen cluster to help decarbonize our industrial sector in South Louisiana? Also on the hydrogen front, there's HALO, hydrogen, Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, a 3-state effort that is pursuing one of these hydrogen hubs from the U.S. Department of Energy that was identified or put in that law, the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed in November of 2021. And DOE's decision to name these 6 or 8 or 10 regional hubs could be made as early as next month. And we're talking about potentially as much as $1 billion coming to these 3 states to work on both, not only the supply side of the hydrogen equation, but also the demand side. Where can we use it? Can we use it for the maritime industry? Can we use it for fuel cells? Those types of things are all baked in to this very, very extensive application that HALO has made to the Department of Energy. And lastly, I'll maybe build on Jonathan's brief comments about carbon sequestration. Again, we find ourselves right in the middle of this older but yet proven technology, and there are several factors that work in Louisiana's favor. We have emitters of carbon dioxide. One thing we learned a couple summers ago in our greenhouse gas emission inventory update, 2/3 of greenhouse gases in Louisiana are produced by industry, and electric generation and transportation are a distant second and third. Most other states, that's flipped. Industry is much lower in the rankings than they are in Louisiana. We also have extensive geologic sinks. The areas underground that could store this carbon dioxide gas maybe 5,000 feet below the surface and keep it there. Ricky's slide certainly made it very clear about the extensive pipeline network that we have really along the entire U.S. Gulf Coast, but certainly in Louisiana. You know, Denbury has had a carbon dioxide pipeline through the state, and now ExxonMobil in the last month announced its intentions to purchase Denbury. So you're talking about, again, major companies that are getting into this sequestration activity. And again, the Department of Natural Resources has tried to approach this from kind of a reliable regulatory format standpoint. That's why DNR made the application to become the third state to try to get Class 6 injection well primacy, so DNR can begin to process those permits that they think they can do much faster and regulate those Class 6 wells. And certainly Gulf Coast sequestration here in Southwest Louisiana, they were really the first mover from a carbon sequestration standpoint. They filed the first Class 6 injection well permit in the state, and really since then, Gulf Coast sequestration has announced some other innovative partnership in this carbon removal space. And again, Cameron LNG, Venture Global, they've all talked about bolting on sequestration activities to their current and future operations. So I'll leave it there. Again, hopefully that gives you a little bit of flavor of these new energy opportunities that are ahead of us, and I appreciate you guys having me.